So hello and welcome to this, our third Tuesday of July virtual sessions, part of the extended 2021 conference of the Association for Documentary Editing. I'm Catherine Tomaszek and I will be moderating today's first session, which is entitled Encoding as Scholarship, Preparing Uniquely Formatted Texts like Galley Proofs and Stationer's Works. Before we begin our presentations, my job is to tell you two things. First, this session is being recorded. And second, we look forward to a lively discussion during the final 20 or 30 minutes of the session, and we encourage you to post your questions or comments or questions that are more of a comment at any time during this session. We have some very full bios posted on the conference webpage, so rather than read those and take up time, I think we'll get started. For our first presentation, we have Brett Barney and Ashlyn Stewart from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln on encoding Chestnut's galley proofs. Brett and Ashlyn, take it away.
Thanks so much, Kathy, for that brief introduction. Okay, is everyone seeing my slides? Thumbs up, awesome.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, we are Brett Barney and Ashlyn Stewart, and we're here to present a little bit about the encoding of corrected galley proofs at the Charles Chestnut Digital Archive. We know this is going to be one of those look at our weird document presentations, but we will do our best to make it interesting. Lots of people have galley proofs and lots of projects and papers include galley proofs. So we also hope that our experiences and thoughts about Chestnut's corrected galley proofs will be applicable to other digital editing projects. The Charles Chestnut Digital Archive was created in 1997 under the direction of Stephanie Browner as a semester-long collaborative project in an undergraduate class at Berea College. For many years, it existed as an HTML, excuse me, an HTML-based site with content created by students. Browner was, however, aware of the work of other early literary websites, such as the William Blake Archive and the Rossetti Archive and the Whitman Archive, and aspired to create for Chestnut something similar. In the meantime, however, she became a university administrator and therefore had very little time of her own to devote to the site and no ready access to student labor. In about 2008, by the way, she contacted Catherine Walter, who is co-director of the Center for Digital Research in the Humanities here at Nebraska, where Ashlyn and I are, and wanted to explore the possibility of ingesting the Chestnut Archive into NINES, which stands for Networked Infrastructure for 19th Century Electronic Scholarship, if you're not familiar with it. It was a Mellon-funded project conceived by Jerome McGann, as this is a quote from him, an online environment for publishing peer-reviewed research in 19th century British and American studies. And it relied on RDF representations of texts. And I had already been working with the NINES team to create RDF representations of Whitman documents, Whitman Archive documents. So I was recruited to do the same for Chestnut. And so that was my entree into my introduction to the Charles Chestnut Digital Archive.
The fact that the archive lasted until 2008 and is still even online today shows how durable that HTML and CSS that Stephanie's students created and her tenacity and dedication to keep it going. But by that time and now, you can see on our slide, the site was starting to show its age. Of particular concern was the difficulty in adding new content, the lack of a dedicated search, and the poor mobile view, which is here on the right and is hard on devices they hadn't even conceived of yet in the late 90s. After a lot of effort from Browner and from the CDRH at Nebraska, led here by Ken Price and Matt Cohen, in 2019, the Chestnut Archive was awarded a Humanities Collections and References Resources Grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities. And that grant support has enabled us to create an underlying infrastructure for the site, including GitHub-based data management and a customizable API that is more sustainable and will more easily allow for future expansion. It has also given us the ability to convert the entire site into TEI compliant XML and make it redesigned for a more user-friendly interface and making it all searchable. But most importantly to our presentation today, the site's manuscript wing was able to be expanded to include galley proofs.
Before we could do anything with galley proofs, we first had to convert the HTML encoded text to TEI. Beyond the oft-cited usability benefits of TEI, for example, the ability to aggregate data across projects or sophisticated discovery and display, the use of TEI encoding has become a basic requirement for many humanities grants, of course. And so there was a strong motivation to convert the HTML to TEI. This image is of the old site with a lift out of what the old HTML encoding looked like. We took the textual transcription and with the help of some stellar undergraduate researchers like Ashley Morrison at CDRH, our local whiz, Laura Weekly, whose title is Metadata Encoding Specialist, was able to translate all of those old tags and HTML relics into up-to-date TEI. Another challenge she faced was adding metadata about each document. The metadata had been separate from each file on the old site in a big one large about file instead of embedded in each document. So they had to match up the HTML text with that repository. She also had to develop encoding guidelines that would standardize all the documents on the site, or at least a category of them. Those guidelines determined how we structured the metadata and how we encoded the text itself.
Once we had updated the existing HTML as well as agreed on how to best apply the TEI guidelines to those pieces of correspondence, reviews, and published works like essays, stories, and articles, we could dive into our personal favorite part of the grant and attempt to transcribe and encode Chestnut's hand-corrected page proofs for 4 of his major works, the book-length works, The Conjure Woman, The Marrow of Tradition, Frederick Douglass, and The House Behind the Cedars. Frederick Douglass is a biography, and then the rest are novels. The current TEI standard, P5, offers no real guidelines or examples on how to encode marginal proofreading marks or how the editorial corrections in the body should be tied to the margins. We therefore have been forced to establish our own guidelines, which we hope will be of great value to other projects seeking to make proofs digitally available. We've documented our decisions and practices along with examples, and we'll eventually make that document public. Brett and I worked with our project manager, Kevin McMullen, as well as in consultation with the project directors, and they continue to be refined based on input from the graduate researchers themselves who are actually going through and encoding, or went through and encoded the documents.
We won't bore you with the entire guideline document, but we will go over some major highlights, what we think they're highlights. We grouped Chestnut's interventions into 4 categories that correspond with TEI elements: additions, deletions, substitutions, and transpositions. This page here shows examples of each of the first 3. Chestnut has added Dave had gone, and he's deleted got there, and he's replaced it with reached her. In each instance, we explain where the change happened, which margin he made the change in, usually. We also show which hand he made the change in, which in this case is blue pencil, but sometimes he does that in black ink or black pencil. Crucially, we tie each of the marginal notations to the inline change using a series of IDs and targets. While doing this is tedious, it makes it unambiguous which intervention affected which lines, regardless of the display. Finally, we have to mark all of the little characters Chestnut has used to explain and draw attention to the changes he wants, known in TEI parlance as metamarks. On the upper left, he'd used a deli sign to indicate a deletion. That's a character that caused some problems and that we had to get a bit creative with because it turns out that Unicode doesn't include many proofreading marks. We also used meta marks to indicate that paragraph sign, the pilcrow, as well as the caret beneath that line. So that gives you the big picture of the galley proof encoding. Now we'll spend a few minutes on the nitty-gritty details of some of the encoding. At this point, it's probably worth mentioning that we often struggled with how to reflect the changes to the document without assigning intent to Chestnut, which we're trying to avoid doing. Our goal was to use TEI to describe the document as found. Perhaps even more than with other kinds of text, these corrected proofs, quickly expose problems for that ideal. We often found ourselves inferring where he wanted a change to be made based on symbols, especially where he was inconsistent. Even in our presentation today, as we discuss specific examples, you'll probably hear us slip and say things like Chestnut wanted or something. So we hope you'll forgive our laziness or lack of imagination. In our efforts to honor the document, we've encoded what we are pretty sure are some of Chestnut's mistakes, but it hasn't always been as easy to distinguish those from our own failures of knowledge or imagination.
So first, we have an example of an addition that seems pretty straightforward, but quickly becomes elaborate with encoding. You can see from the marginal comma and its attention drawing line and the inline caret that Chestnut wants to add a comma after the word borrowing. So if that was all he wanted, we could just add the comma or take the comma and wrap it in an add tag. But we want to convey more information about that add. We want to show the hand, like we mentioned, where it was made. So we need to add attributes like hand and place. We also need to give it an XML ID so that we can associate it with other parts of the intervention. Next, we need to capture the solidus that accompanies the comma. Chestnut used soliduses, or maybe solidi, we don't know, all over the proof sheets to ensure that those small changes in the margins wouldn't get lost. And we call them emphatic soliduses, which would be a great band name. But they're used to draw attention to changes rather than to make more changes. So they're encoded as metamarks and wrapped in a metamark tag. We have to use the / to represent that vertical line in most of our encoding. And as a metamark, you can see that it receives it receives the attributes of a function with the value emphasize. And it's also wrapped in an add because it is a metamark, but it's also an addition to the text. When you look at that function and see that it says emphasize, in general, we assigned active verbs for our values in the attribute function like add, delete, or transpose. After we've addressed the comma and its solidus, it's time to turn our attention to the caret in the text. That caret shows where the comma should be added and can be represented with the Unicode 8248. And once again, we want to say more about the caret. We want to show what its function is, which is to add, and it also needs a target to match that first comma's XML ID. And we've wrapped the caret in a metamark and an add for the same reasons. So when you look at it one too many. When you look at it all together, you can see that it is a lot more than just adding the comma, which is what we really would have liked to do, but allows us to account for all the nuance of the intervention.
I'm going to digress just a minute. I originally learned TEI in the early 2000s, so I'm kind of a fossil. When I joined the Whitman Archive staff to encode both printed and manuscript texts, and in that era, the guidelines, which were pre-XML and in their P3 instantiation, had nothing to offer for some fairly common textual phenomena, especially ones that occur primarily in modern manuscripts. Transposition is a good example. So to encode Whitman's transpositions, which we encountered fairly often, which was a phenomenon we encountered fairly often in his manuscripts, I devised a custom element, transpose, which we added to our own schema. Anyway, and it takes a target attribute keyed to an anchor where the block of text is to be relocated. And this example is from the Whitman archive. Let's see. And as you can see, it's fairly, it's relatively clean. At least it looks clean compared to the encoding, the kind of an ornate encoding that Ashlyn has given an example of, and that is typical of the galley proofs. This is a little bit simplified, but at any rate, unfortunately, it never occurred to me to propose that to the TEI that they add a transpose element to their tag set. At that time, I was just a guy working on a project somewhere. And as a result, I was dismayed when the P5 guidelines came out and found that there was a new element with the same name, transpose, but that had been conceived quite differently. The guidelines identify transpositions in terms of the presence of, this is a quote, metamarks indicating that passages should be moved to a different position. The mixture of plural and singular in that passage, a document, passages, a different position, leave room for ambiguity as to whether transposition is being regarded as the translocation of a single bit of text or the swapping places of two bits of text. However, both the case study that's offered and let's see, I think we're on the next slide. Yep. Yeah, and the case study that's offered, which is from, as a prototypical example, and this is from an Ibsen manuscript, and the encoding that has been devised to account for it, make it clear that the TI Council was thinking of transposition as the swapping of two bits of text rather than the translocation of a single bit of text. At any rate, the Chestnut galley proofs include examples of the model illustrated in the TI guidelines quite closely, as in this example here, where he's switching the positions of those two letters. More frequent, however, are cases in which the corrections are more like the ones I was familiar with from Whitman manuscripts, and those that indicate the movement of a single textual unit, as in this example, which is, I apologize, it's a little bit messy because other things are going on, but the thing I want you to notice is the movement of that bit of text. I can't read it, let's see. Yeah, thank you. Her second cousin, right, which is marked to be moved to a later position in the sentence. It's possible to encode such instances in the orthodox TEI way, and because we very much wanted to avoid having to modify the TI schema for the Chestnut archive galley proofs project, we somewhat reluctantly decided to be orthodox.
We have another couple of examples that we thought some of you might find compelling. One of them is encountering the different unusual additions and deletions, sometimes regarding space. Dealing with space is much less straightforward than a character, so our encoding had to reflect that. Here's an example where Chestnut wanted to delete a space and then add, so he used that close up kind of bird's eye symbol to delete, and then the good old pound sign to add one. He's essentially moving the apostrophe before ter, but of course doesn't mark it like that, so we can't encode it like that. Our first step is to wrap the space before ter in a seg, and by giving that space a tag and an XML ID, we protect it from getting lost and can associate it with other marks in the document. Next, we want to address the meta mark that is concerned with the space we just protected, which is here. It's a meta mark that needs to be marked in an add and has a target and the function delete. It's conceptually a little tricky to think about an add with a function delete, but it just shows how we had to reconcile the additions to the manuscript with their meanings. Next, we have to capture the pound sign. If all we wanted to show was the writing of a pound sign, we would simply make it a meta mark with the function add and a place within the add tag. But we want to show that the pound sign isn't really a pound sign, it's a symbol used to represent space. So we wrapped the pound sign in an arrig reg tag that shows both Chestnut's original mark and what we, the editors, interpret it to mean. That arrig is the pound and that the reg is the space that we infer him to desire. In that case, we know it from our proofreaders' guides and our own editing education for that's what it means. After we've addressed the close-up and the pound sign, it's time to turn our attention to the caret in the text. This example is extra tricky because the close-up technically applies before the caret, but the space that's added is where the caret is. So again, we had to use our best guess and infer what was going on. And we used that same Unicode to wrap it in a meta mark with the same attributes for function and target. One final encoding example shows Chestnut's incredible attention to detail and the suffering we underwent because of it. Just kidding. We're really happy for him, but it does show the depths of what we had to encode. So here, Chestnut has noticed that the type for the S he underlined is upside down. Yes, an S, which really looks the same from the bottom up. But this is just one example of Chestnut's eagle eyes. He also catches wrong fonts, spacing issues with leading, spacing issues with kerning. And here we had to figure out how we could show that he cared about that upside down S. So we started by showing what is underlined with a high tag to show that he highlighted it with our familiar attributes hand and XML ID, and one that should be familiar to a lot of you, rend with the value underline. The marginal character is represented with, or the marginal swirl is represented with the Unicode 2537, which we'll talk about in a minute. It's encoded as a meta mark with the same functions and wrapped in an add. This example shows the limits really of what our encoding can capture. Unlike with the pound sign, we couldn't really express the full extent of the problem or Chestnut's intent in fixing it. We didn't actually make the upside down S upside down, and we didn't show that turning it is what Chestnut wanted to happen. Instead, we simply had to reflect what was on the page with showing our inference without showing our inferences as readily in the encoding. All we could do was tell users that he marked an S and associated a swirl with it.
Although Unicode is a vast territory with code points defined for a great many of the world's languages, as well as for a great many extra linguistic symbols. And here I just wanted to give you some of the examples that I think are kind of humorous. Nest with eggs is a Unicode character. Melting face has a Unicode point, and 3D left lighted downwards equilateral arrowhead has a Unicode point. However, proofreading marks are generally absent from Unicode. Even though they're standard, conventionally agreed upon symbols, many of the symbols that Chestnut used on the corrected proofs have no standard character encoding. Ashlyn and I and other members of the team didn't always immediately recognize or even recognize or understand them, but we had no great difficulty in locating them in reference works about printing. And this is an example. These are examples on this slide from a 1928 reference book. For example, to indicate that a piece of type needed to be turned, Chestnut used that swirl, the sort of mark you might draw to represent the eye of a mesmerized cartoon character. At least that's the way I thought of it. It's a simple character, though we weren't too surprised to find that it's not represented in Unicode. We were a little puzzled, though, to find that the deli character, so ubiquitously used to indicate a deletion, that it shows up in professors' marginal marks on student papers even now, also has no Unicode representation. Ignoring such key marks in our transcription was not an option. We couldn't just not represent them, nor we decided was omitting them from the display. So we settled for the time being on the expeditious, though admittedly highly unsatisfactory, option of using lookalike Unicode characters to represent them. In the fullness of time, we plan to submit a proposal for inclusion of proofreading marks to the Unicode Consortium. As a large body made up of members with a wide range of interests that creates a standard that's important to a diverse international constituency, the consortium does not carry out its activities in haste. Although the consortium's deliberate nature is a virtue, it means that our 3-year grant on this project could not afford to wait on an action to create new Unicode code points. So our deli is represented by number 977, which is actually capital theta. Our swirl is number 2537, the Bengali digit 3. And our push down leading or other things that are showing on the as inked is number 8869 and uptack, which is a mathematical operator.
You've seen that all of our encoding winds up being much longer than the number of characters Chestnut altered, and deciding how we wanted to display that became a challenge. Karen Dalzell in the CDRH took the lead and decided on a mobile first approach, which is a best practice in responsive web design. It's easier to design for the browser with the fewest features and the least display room, and then work your way up than the other way around. In practice, this meant moving the display of the content inline instead of retaining the use of margins, and indicating left or right margins with words rather than visually, which had the added bonus of being more accessible for non-sighted users who might use a screen reader. We have displayed all the text in Chestnut's hand in that gold double underline throughout the site, and our other design sources or choices have a key that the user can show or hide. Here's another view of what the web display looks like along with the thumbnail image. We ultimately made our peace with representing our encoding on the page in maybe a less than ideal manner, because the reader can see the image right there if desired. The thumbnail grows to be full screen and even zooms in if someone just really needs to see that apostrophe for themselves. To give you a brief teaser of our new site, which will launch in just a few days, really. This is one of our manuscript pages shown with the new site header. And here's the in progress homepage. Our artist, Kat Weiss's finished illustration is what you see there. She designed art for the site. We were happy to be able to commission new artwork. And they're pleased with what the work she did. We are still actively working on the site, very close to rolling it out, very, very close to rolling it out. It'll launch just in the next couple of days, but you can see some of the concepts in action here. The large screen view fills the width with that illustration. And then on the side there, you see the mobile view, which shrinks the illustration to make room for more content. And so stay tuned. In just a few days, you can go to chestnutarchive.org and see some wonderful galley proofs. But thank you for your time.
Yes, thanks.
There I am unmuting. Thank you so much. That's fascinating. I'm always interested to see how legacy sites can be updated. And this is really very beautiful. So congratulations. And as I said at the beginning, we are happy to take questions or comments. And we'll come to those at the end of the session. In the meantime, is this really in the meantime? Our second presentation is from Lisa Hermsen and Rebecca Walker from the Rochester Institute of Technology. And the title of the presentation is Editing a Rare 19th Century Stationer's Works Manual, Encoding as Discovery. So Lisa and Rebecca, take it away.
Okay. Firstly, I guess I'd say thank you for a wonderful presentation. And I imagine we share headaches, so it will be interesting to see your final presentation. Our presentation, I think, will stay at the macro level. We hope to show some of the markup decisions that we are either making or stuck with. It's a very idiosyncratic text of the William Townsend and Sons from Sheffield manuscript collection. And that offers a sort of rare look into the 19th century stationery binding for the manufacturing of double account books. The volume is a binding that is a sister art to letterpress binding. So if you're familiar with letterpress binding, it is very ornate and decorative, while stationery and vellum binding are meant to be very useful and typically meant to be written in, not to be read. And so it's a different kind of book binding. It's rare to find such documents that reveal the day-to-day practices of printers, binders, stationers. A lot of these business records are ephemeral, and most often these do not survive to the present day. Our curator at Cary Library at RIT has talked about the importance for the digital preservation and presentation of the Townsend and Son archive. Suggests that those will contribute to a more realistic understanding of practices in the book trade in the 19th century and will be a rich source of cultural ideas and practices beyond book history. So the William Townsend Works Manual will be working on volume 3. It has made up of 5 volumes. We're choosing volume number 3 because it's sort of the most interesting and most complicated. The project intends to digitize the volumes, but also provide a robust markup with a searchable database and a user interface. So we're on our way toward a later goal, starting off with some difficult pages. One of the interesting things I think is that our project management has emphasized very distributed collaborative decision-making with undergraduate students. And so our undergraduate students actually have looked at modules and have made recommendations and decisions about how to encode certain things. They're very familiar with the text. And just yesterday, somebody said, "Are we encoding father?" Which is a long story, but it was a good question. Rebecca, do you want to go back to slide 2? Just quickly. I just want to mention that the full collection is digitized at that site. So if you would want to go and click on that, you could. One other quick mention is that the account books typically, historically, have started with these kind of praise the Lord readings type things. And William Townsend does the same. He has a little piece there on the value of time. But there's one little section there that's peace and grace be in this place. So there's a kind of following of the historical tradition of account books and accounting there. So you could go back to 4.
Right. So in our presentation today, we're going to show you a number of pages and have some call outs about some of the more interesting and difficult elements that represent those pages and sort of take you through some decisions that we've made. And as Lisa said before, some decisions we're kind of like, we understand we need to make, but that's the next phase of our project. And so these first couple pages here on the left, we see page 252. This manuscript is very, it's a work manual. And so it's full of like notes about work, but also includes like inserts and pasted articles, letters, receipts in certain cases. So here we see a pasting from the Printing and Allied Trade Association, along with some of Townsend's notes on the right margin. With the, he draws these really lovely call outs and writes his notes on the side about direct charges, indirect, etc. So a choice that we've made so far is that the inserts, we are tagging inserts as a certain type of div. So we're using divs with types, which I'll talk about in a minute, but we are not encoding the words or transcribing the words that appear in inserts at this time, but we're providing like description of what the insert is, but we will transcribe and encode the words that Townsend writes on the side. So we do kind of have an issue with this particular page because he's tying notes to specific portions of the insert. So that is something that maybe we will have to confront in the future, but you can see kind of his lovely hand and some of the interesting things that pop up. The page on the right, we see is page 28. So it's pretty early in the manuscript, and this covers, roughly 1835 to 1910. And so these dates we see on the page, we see two dates, June 1891 and August 1893. So those are about 60 years into the coverage of the document itself, and they're pretty early on. And so seeing where he puts dates is really interesting. And we would have a database of relevant names and materials otherwise, but the dates are interesting in that we can see kind of how he goes back and kind of writes notes about things and how they line up or they don't line up, because if you were thinking about this as a methodical front to back, these dates A would not occur on the same page and B would not occur so close to the beginning. So that's one thing. And then another element of this page 28 is that we don't have a typical, there's really no strict organization of this manuscript. So we can't necessarily use traditional text breaks. So like P for paragraph, the element. And so we have chosen instead to be using ABs, which are abstract blocks, because as we see on this page, we kind of have groupings of words by theme, like the top talks about trade mills or travelers, and then the bottom is about overtime. Some interesting, a lot of interesting thoughts about wages and unions in this book, but they don't go together in a way that is necessarily cohesive. And this page is a lot more cohesive than a lot of other pages that we have. And so we've been using ABs to organize those, and also divs, which I think is on the next page, well, 2 pages. So this page example shows just a version of our early encoding. We've been working together with the undergraduates, and really they have been working with us for the last 2 years to build this from the ground up. We all kind of started, frankly, from the same place. Even me as a digital humanities librarian, I understood in theory how to apply TEI and encode a text, but had never done it beyond like a 2-hour workshop. And so it's much different in practice when you are, it seems like it would be simple enough to start, but when you're starting with the huge manuscript, it's a lot. It's a lot of decisions that you have to make simultaneously, and a lot of cascading decisions, as I think probably all of you know. But so we see an early example here of and we see the divs in practice. So we are tagging, we're putting types on divs and using those to kind of guide the themes or the intentions of the page. So we see on this page a div type of instruction and a div type of log. We're also using div as insert, like I said on the last page, and then index, which is the one section of the book that is like a logistical section. He has an index at the beginning. So that is a div. So this is some of our early work. There's already some things that we've changed and updated, but Okay, so this page represents some other decisions that we've been able to make and show some of the some of the meat, the real meat of what's going on in the manuscript. So Townsend, as an account binder, writes about what he calls the best banker's way. So at the top here, he says, quote, "The secret of making account books durable, sound, and good, I call best banker's way." And then he goes on to describe what that means exactly. He describes, your paper, and you should work with people and like a talented man, as he says. And then, get a good mill, and then he references a bunch of pages or pages that might reference different mills. So he describes in detail, inks you should use and scraps and gives a lot of advice. And so this is his way of describing account books so that they lay flat for double entry accounting, which is the whole idea of best banker's way. This page also represents just sort of how names and organizations are kind of sprinkled and dispersed throughout the manuscript. And in many cases, a name, like a proper name, might also be in the name of an organization. And so we have a lot of nested name tags. So like a purse name inside an org name, if it's a firm. So Thomas Firth and Sons Thomas Firth is tagged as a person inside the larger organization name. So all of those contribute to our database, which we have started, but is growing. And then we also see here at the top, just a pretty brief example of, kind of like a note that he took later that we call, random missives that he writes around in the margins. And already on this little note he keeps about seasoning for your paper, he references different pages in the manuscript. So we do have a system of pointing and referencing and tagging, but it is not necessarily evenly applied, but just so he keeps pointing and referencing to other pages. This one is one takeaway from this page as well.
So this is definitely what we would call a financial document. And the next slides will show that some of the problems we have encountered with the encoding have to do with tables, particularly tables with a lot of numbers, especially when those numbers are measurements and when those are arithmetic and when they become formulas. So there's been a lot of talk among a lot of us as we encode about how best to do that. And we're going to show you just a few of the pages that create havoc for us. So this page seems like a clean one, by the way. This is a fairly simple version of what we're working on. But as you take it down a little further, especially as our undergraduates have had to sort of work on this, you see on the left side, we're talking about sizes of books. Sizes of books will then turn into financials for how much an account book would cost. So it's a fairly important piece of information here. What you have is different types of paper. So you probably heard of foolscap and demi, imperial. What that means, though, those are sizes of papers. Probably most of you know that. Then you have quarto and octavo here, meaning the folds in the paper. So you have paper size, you have the number of folds, and then you have the number of sheets that he has. So it's sheets plus folds plus size of paper. And then you have that equation there. That's if you could do the math, you would, it's doable. The question is how to represent it. Do you put an 8 and a, and I think this is the Unicode and the problem and the TI problem, as well as, the basic sort of, if we wanted to do this as a formula, how would that work? And how important is it to represent it as a formula rather than as numbers? And what does that mean for kind of the encoding decisions that we are going to have to make as we go? business, wages, et cetera, are going to be more complicated. We have started using measurements with type because, particularly because when we start to try to decide if something is a commodity or a unit or quantity, things get complicated, and especially for students who are encoding these things. And so it has helped to sort of put a place marker in there that says this is a measurement of this type, and we'll come back to it and figure out how to encode it as we know more about measurements. So here is our real problem, if you want to sort of talk about getting into the meat of the difficulty of encoding this text. This is a table with a table and another table. So you have the foolscap post dummy. On the right, you have something that is really difficult to decipher unless you understand that it is pointing to the keys at the bottom of the page. So the keys are for binding and for ruling. I have that backwards, ruling and binding. So Roman numerals indicate the type of ruling to be used, and key letters indicate the type of binding to be used on the above. So deciding again which details are going to be important to encode here, deciding what we should capture, whether that table on the right with that points to the key, how to manage that, how to wrestle with it, and whether or not pointing is going to have to be at all necessary again. So that is one of the complexities just for trying to figure out how to represent that page, how to represent the tables on the page, and how to capture the meaningful information on that page. Then this is the pages that, this is a page that we like. It has really good, interesting information on it. So even though the tabular information seems really messy, it's actually interpretable. And there's interesting stuff there. So when he's talking about office capacity, one of the things he's talking about is machinery, and the other thing he's talking about is people. And we have wages and hours and union wages. So what you're seeing there, there's two sides typically of the print shop. You have the setting and the machinery. And you can see the hours, and you can see the pay per hours for the foreman and the apprentice, for example, or if you go down below for the help. So you can sort of see who's being paid how much, which is pretty interesting. And then you can also see, and this is sort of the problem for, again, tabular information, you see two lists below, like what would look like as apprentice. Those two lists give us rent, light, power, taxes. And so those lists then move over into that total monetary value. And that's where, so you have a list and a list and a table and a table. And that's again where things get a little messy, but this is information we would want to capture. And so, working through exactly how to render that page with TEI is sort of, again, where we scratch our heads and ask our consultant for help. So this sort of tells you the decisions that we have been made that seem like they've been, looking back, they seem as though they were basic decisions at the time. They did not feel that way. I want to just suggest, talk about the punctuation, because that seemed like a decision that we were set on early. And yes, we were going to regularize punctuation. We're going to put in periods where there were none so that it would be easier for our readers to read. However, as the last presenters talked about, the intent there was a huge editorial decision, and we probably should not have made that. Later, we went back and we had all 4 of the team members select a bunch of pages, and we transcribed them with and without the punctuation. And it became very clear that, in fact, we had made the wrong decision, and we went back to our documentation and we went back through the pages we had transcribed at that point and pulled all the punctuation that was not there out. The decisions we have yet to make, you've seen. We are just struggling with numbers, measurement tables, arithmetic, especially since 19th century arithmetic is kind of different. Monetary values, etc. Pointing attributes, and we've been wrestling with that for a little while, and I think until we do, until we encounter a few more pages and are able to sort of just commit to a few decisions, and we'll be okay.
Great. Okay, so just briefly about the our team. So Lisa and I started this project and really co-lead the project. We started in January 2019. So we've been working together for 2.5 years, and we hired students very shortly after we started. So in the spring of 2019, we hired both Jay and Jacob on this slide. Jacob has since graduated, and Jay is still with us, which is excellent. We have had a very small team, and we worked together to really build this from the ground up. And undergraduates make great collaborators, and especially when they can contribute to they get to do the work, they get to do the hands-on, and they also get to contribute to the editorial decisions and all of those things. So that's been wonderful. And we also consult with Dr. Sarah Connell, who's at Northeastern. And I would say probably without her, we would not be in as good of a spot, because she helps us to set our TEI straight. So she's been invaluable. So we have a great team. Just some early milestones. We had to work from the ground up to create a customized schema that pulled from different, all the different modules in the TEI. And we created this with the undergraduates, and we had one in late 2019. So I think 8 or 9 months into the project, starting the project. And since then, we have obviously revised this, obviously. We also started, internal documentation, which we call the IED, or the internal encoding document, with, accompanying style sheets and workflow documents and all sorts of things. And these have also, these are very iterative and, update as we update, and we work with students on what works for them and what do we really need to track, et cetera. And then number 3, early milestone, is sort of the phase we're in now, where we're continually building out these things, but we're working with everyone to, review where we're at, review encoding, make sure everything is sound. And we're starting to, develop some of the more, like the meat, the core, I keep saying meat, develop the meat of the project. So like the, expanding the database, making decisions about customization, things like that. So these documents on this slide show just kind of how we work together and track some of the early decisions. The document on the left is our assignments for reviewing the TEI modules, and then whether or not they're being included in the schema. The spreadsheet on the right shows different elements that we included in the schema, the module that they're from the TEI, whether we're putting an attribute on it, and then if it has an open or closed list on that attribute, and has been really helps keep track of everything. So this is an example of just our group work, how we work together. And then these are screenshots from our internal documentation, just showing how we progress and track what we're changing, people's inputs, people's questions or issues that arise, or we even assign tasks on the document. So Jay, please pull example of X and put it in. So we communicate with students, in person and in meetings, but also inside the documents that we're using, and we all contribute to the documentation. And then on the right, we see like an example, as all TEI documentation, the case studies and things. So an image if we think it's relevant, and then the encoding as that goes. So yes, and then now this is kind of Just kind of a catch-all slide to show sort of the phase that we're in now with reviewing and how we're expanding and progressing on the project. So we're using XPath right now to review files that have been encoded. We've encoded about 100 pages of the 400 pages at what we're calling an initial level. Because we've done really great work, and the students particularly have done most of the encoding, if we're being honest. But we now need to go back and make sure that everything is sound and that everything is up to what we said we would do, and then thinking about how we can go back in and fill out some of the more important questions to the project, like the measurement is key, and that's really our next phase. So we've been using XPath, and the rightmost image there is from Discord, which we use to communicate with the students. And then the middle, Lisa, do you want to say anything about the research you've been doing?
Well, there's been just some primary source research that's allowed us to understand that there are 3 or 4 Townsends, 2 of them Williams, and so trying to figure out hand. And we had one student who was really interested in hand, went to talk to our curator about that, so that students have actually not just been encoding, but actually looking at the scholarship as well. You'll see there's a red basil, by the way, in terms of the kinds of vellum that could be used. And I thought, what the heck, there's no such thing as red basil, and there is. So our students are learning a lot about bookbinding and about primary source usage as well. So they're for us to see their encoding become scholarship is exciting. I guess takeaways, we definitely, because I don't know that it's because we have such a strange document in front of us, but it does seem that that it's been iterative, because we've kind of had to go back and say, is that really what we want to do? We've had to adapt the project management as the project actually just moves on, and as we know more about the manuscript, that has changed. As I said, I don't think I need to repeat the undergraduate student participants are both encoders and researchers, and they've really become sort of enmeshed and engaged in this project, and that's for us a really exciting piece of the project. I guess the only thing I would say in the end is that, so Townsend was one of the oldest printing businesses in Sheffield, and it can certainly be studied as a top-down daily practice print firm, but that it also marks a lot of cultural and financial changes that went on during the Industrial Revolution. Sheffield was Steel City, Sheffield outrages really set the stage for unionization in the UK. So it marks both a lot of financial information, but also a lot of cultural, historical, social information that is really valuable and that should come out of such a rare document, but that doesn't if you do flat transcription. And so the necessity of TEI is there. The questions remain about how much we could capture.
Thank you.
Another wonderful presentation. Thank you both so much. This fascinates me, obviously. And we have 15 minutes available for questions and answers. And as you can all see in, as you all, our panelists can see, we have one question in the chat that is about the stellar work of undergraduate and graduate students. And we've heard quite a lot from Lisa and Rebecca about these wonderful RIT undergrads. Brett and Ashlyn, would you like to add to that from the UNL perspective?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you talked about yours, because now we get to rave about ours. Yeah, the first kind of step towards the revival of the website at UNL was the work of an undergraduate researcher named Bianca Swift. And she took on starting to transcribe some of Chestnut's correspondence, which we have. There's volumes of collected editions of it, but not as readily available online. So she kind of took the lead in we call them a UCare grant, which is an
internal program.
Yeah, undergraduate research focus. There's across all disciplines. And Ken and Matt kind of helped her get started on that project. It's actually funded with Pepsi money, so I guess we have to thank you, Pepsi. But she has done a fantastic job with the correspondence, and we're excited that now on the new site, it'll be able to be ingested in and kind of bring her work of the last 3 years to life. And she is also a poet and has written a fair bit of, she does a lot of slam poetry. So I don't actually know if she's written any for publication yet, or if it's been ones that she's all performed, but I'm going to try to find the video and put it in the chat of kind of her like culminating of the UCare grant. Most recent one was about the process of doing research on Chestnut and how that felt as a Black researcher researching an African-American from the past and what that meant to her. So I'm going to try to find it. I think I have it saved on my YouTube and I'll put it in.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
But grad students have also, I'm a grad student, have been instrumental in developing the guidelines when I worked with Kevin and Brett. And then my fellow grad student, Sam Gilmore, and I did mostly the first pass of encoding the manuscripts and then peer proofed each other before Brett and Kevin encoded a little bit too, and then kind of did the next proofing. So yeah, proofing. So we have enjoyed working across different levels of the university, and it's been great to have people's different priorities, like Bianca being concerned more about his language, and Sam is more of an early 19th centuryist, so thinking about his reflections on history, and I'm interested in book history, so being able to bring all of that different priorities together.
Just very, very quickly, one of the surprising, well, surprising to me just because I'm old, troubles that Bianca has had is just the basics of reading script. And I find that most young undergraduates have some trouble reading, especially 19th century scripts. And one of the things that they become interested in is script, and the use of script and vocabulary, and just the whole difference in language is more stark for them.
You also reminded me, there were also undergrads at the CDRH. We kind of have our Whitman thing, and then across the side, Whitman and Chestnut, and across the sidewalk is the actual center. And I mentioned Ashley Morrison did the TEI with Laura. So they did some of the encoding of the published works more than the manuscripts themselves. But there's a little cadre of awesome undergrads who've worked on it for years sometimes. So we're so grateful.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Lisa and Rebecca, is there anything else you would like to say about undergrads before we, which is, I assume, who you all have, only undergrads, is that correct? Like us here, yeah.
Yeah, only undergrads.
And typically just 2 or 3 at a time. But they're pretty, they understand the project, and they understand the management of the project and sort of the timing. And I think that's probably Rebecca's doing, but I think that's one of the things that I found is that for undergraduate students who may not come always with a sort of sense of what needs to be done and how you would get there, we've had really, really great students who sort of internalize that in a way. But yeah, we've had, our students are great at finding resources. And I guess that's been exciting. It's where do I go to get this question answered? And so they're almost posing little mini research questions and then figuring out how to go get the answers to those. It's really rewarding because I guess, part of it is this is a focus on a real research project outside of their classes. And that's been good for them, at least for the last year anyway.
Makes all of that that abstract education sort of seem like it has some applications.
Yeah.
That's very cool. Thank you. We have another question that is for everybody, and that's about the dangers of inferring or marking up intentionality. So there's a question about whether you'd like to say more about the dangers here. And thank you, Ashlyn, for giving us the link to Bianca's poem. I'm going to copy that for myself.
I think sometimes in our project, we do talk about the dangers of assigning intentionality to Townsend, but I feel, maybe Lisa, you want to weigh in, but I think since we're kind of at the beginning of the project, we're at this stage of how much can we handle doing right now, what makes sense, and what do researchers, what will they want, and what is like necessary to get to that point. So like in terms of the punctuation example that Lisa talked about, that was an instance in which we thought it was a simple decision, but it really turned out that it would have been extremely difficult and also probably editorially inappropriate to just be like, we're just going to add periods and make sentences, because there are almost no periods in this whole book, you know, so like, it would be a big change. But I'm trying to think of other times, sometimes like with the notes that appear, you know, just at random places, we are, you know, anchoring those to blocks of text. And if we can't tell where they go, then we just like say they're at the top, bottom, left, or right, to shy away a little bit from potentially assigning semantic intention. It's not as obvious, I think, as the you know, the editorial marks that Ashlyn talked about, but that is one thing that we run into.
Good, thank you. Brett and Ashlyn, do you have something you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, sure. I think you could tell in our presentation that really has been a sticking point for us with our new historicist training in a historicist project, right? I think similar to Rebecca's point is it's really, if you want a user to be able to get things out of this galley proof beyond looking at them, then our interpretation is maybe the added value or one of the added values. It was interesting, at one point we went to the final copy and saw what had actually changed from this version that we were looking at and the final. And we could tell that some of the proofs were in earlier stages than later ones. Like the Conjure Woman had very few smaller changes, and then I think it was probably the Mirror of Tradition was maybe the worst, or Cedars, I don't know, worst. So we could tell that they were different parts, but we didn't know necessarily what stage. We just had what Fisk was able to maintain. So being able to show what those symbols meant for someone who might not know, being able to show if someone wanted to see that, do that similar comparison, be able to see what the typesetters then didn't get or what they got in a later version. So showing more intent than I'm like often comfortable doing is probably worth it.
Yeah, one of the things that struck me, this is more about actually Lisa and Rebecca's project than my own, but one of the things that struck me as I was looking at that is that it reminded me very much of a very messy manuscript, Whitman manuscript that I'm like very used to working with, because at first you look at it and you go, you're just at a loss to understand anything. You know, it's just an overwhelming amount of information. You know, it's not even information yet. And it takes a lot of time to decipher that and figure out what's going on, as you indicated at several points in your presentation. You know, you said things that made sense of things that were completely mysterious to me. And one of the goals, it seems, of digitizing these things must be to make some of that information, that knowledge that you've created, available. Otherwise, what are we doing? But that's all interpretive, right? That's an interpretive process, and knowing how much of that is appropriate is one thing, and then how much of it is even doable is the really tough question, I think. And boy, I really wanted to have another life in which to devote to your project.
Come on over. I have your headache.
I got really fascinated. I was really getting into it.
Yeah, I think you're right that in order for, because even a transcription you would interpret, but then on a second layer of TEI you have to interpret the transcription. It feels a little, it feels a little heavy-handed sometimes.
What constitutes an ab? I just and the types of divs. How many div types do you have?
6.
Well, we tried to narrow it, and see, that is a place of interpretation that we are slightly still uncomfortable with. We have a div that's a moral principle and a div that's a work ethic. So a moral principle is, way up here, make your mind, into a religious vessel type moral principle, and a work ethic, and he does that. And down here is sort of a be speedy on the shop floor, so though I don't know that those are working, because they do assume some sort of intention that may get us in trouble. So we're still working on the divs as well. Those are decisions that I think we will constantly have to sort of find out. I mean, we did the same thing. We had the group go through several pages and put divs on them, and we all ended up with this, we all ended up in the same place. But I think we need to do that continuously, to see if it, to see how it goes throughout the book. But it sort of feels like sometimes you have to do more interpretation than you'd like.
Yeah, we're running close to time, but I do want to ask you this other question that we have here in the chat. It's one of those questions that we don't like to be asked. One is, it's about how many pages and what percentage is done, and about defending to others the kinds of resources it takes to do this work.
Ours is a little more straightforward.
Yeah.
I was thinking the galley proofs are of differing lengths. The biography is like really long and skinny pages, and it's shorter. And then the novels are 4 up. And then Conjure Woman, which is a collection, I guess Wife and Tradition is also a collection, are 6 up. So it's hard to say how many pages. I would say like upper hundreds, but under 1,000, maybe like 800-ish pages. But then there's fewer images. And they are all done because this is the end of our grant. And to cop out of that question, we were able to justify all of that in the grant. So we just kind of had to deliver on the work plan that we had put out. And we'd be happy to talk more at another time if someone has more questions. And I think our proposal's probably available on the NEH site, but we definitely pass it along if other people have questions.
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, I think for ours, so we, if it works out, volume 3 is 400 pages. So the first volume that we're doing, and the only one we have firm plans to do right now, I should say, is 400 pages. And we have completed about 100 at 75%, I would say, because we want to keep moving and not prevent us from encoding just because we have really difficult decisions to make that we'll have to go back through and add. So that's one. There are 5 volumes, and they are lovely and interesting, but like very difficult in a different way. And so I think we'll have to reassess as we keep going, you know, what we want to keep doing. I'm fortunate in my position to have a lot of autonomy in what projects I devote my time to as a, you know, as a librarian. And then this is Lisa's scholarship. So if we have questions about justifying, you know, amount of time, it's also, we have really strong support in terms of that we're supporting undergraduate students working with us. And so that has always been, always something that people want to support for us. So then we keep going in that way, and hopefully we'll get some stronger funding moving forward.
A nice trick for teaching institutions.
Yeah.
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 This has just been, these have both been wonderful presentations, and I have really appreciated the opportunity to geek out about TEI. And so I thank you all for two just wonderful, wonderful presentations. To the audience, thank you for joining us today, and I encourage you all to come back at 2:15 Eastern Time. And Lisa encourages us to visit the URL to see all 5 volumes because those are all imaged. So thank you all so very much.